Good evening, I hope all is well. I'm sorry that I can't be at the share with you this evening. I am therefore recording the Amud. You can listen to it at your pleasure. Today's Amud is Berachos, Daf Yud Gimel. We are on the second half of Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, so that's 13a, the second half of the Amud. We have the privilege of starting a brand new parak. We're in the brand new parak of Hayakore Batorah, and the Mishnah starts as follows. Hayakore Batorah, a person was sitting and he was learning, and he happens to find himself learning Parshas V'aschanan, and he's up to the psukim of Shema Yisrael. The halacha is, as he is learning those psukim, Higiyaz Mana Mikra, it came time to say Kriya Shema. What do you know? His learning and his davening coincide. So he's learning Parshas V'aschanan, and he comes to the Parsha of Shema. He's up to Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, V'yahavta, and it is just then the time to say Kriya Shema. The halacha is, im kivein libo, if he had in mind, and I'm leaving this very vague intentionally because the Gemara is going to describe this, then yatsa, he has fulfilled his obligation, he has discharged his duty of saying Kriya Shema, if he had in mind to say Kriya Shema. Baprakim. Mishnah continues with another halacha. Baprakim, which means, we're going to describe this later in the Mishnah, but he finds himself between paragraphs of Shema, then or Berachos Kriya Shema, then Shoel B'pnei HaKavod, he's allowed to give greetings to a respected person. Umeshiv, he's also allowed to respond if this respectable person gives him greetings first, he can respond. The Gemara is going to ask, as Rashi points out, that it's obvious if you're allowed to initiate the greetings, then certainly you can respond. But we'll get to that in the Gemara. Now the Mishnah continues, Uba Emtza, if he's in the middle of a paragraph, then he's only allowed to be Shoel Mipnei Hayira. He's only allowed to initiate a greeting if he's scared. Now what does it mean that he's scared? Rashi over here actually writes Mipnei Hayira, Adam Shu Yari Mipanav Sholo Yahargeyu. He's nervous that the person is going to kill him, which is a very big chiddush, because we know the halacha is a person never has to give up their life to fulfill a mitzvah, so why would one think that a person's not allowed to give shalom if he's nervous he's going to get scared? But that is how Rashi learns the Mishnah, and he, again, in the middle of a paragraph, he can initiate a greeting if he's nervous for his life, umeshiv, and he can respond. Divi Rabbi Meir, those are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda switches it up a little bit. He says, Ba'emtza, if you're in the middle of a paragraph, then shalom Mipnei Hayira, you could initiate Mipnei Hayira if you're scared, umeshiv Mipnei HaKavod. You can only respond because of the respect of a person who deserves respect. Ubaprakim, however, if you're between paragraphs, that's much more lenient. In such a case, Shoel Mipnei HaKavod, you can initiate a greeting to a person who is respectable. Umeshiv Shalom L'chol Adam. You can actually respond and return greetings to any person, even if it's not a person who is very respectable or a person who comes along with any kind of threat. Now the Mishnah explains, Elohein Bein HaPrakim. The following areas are considered Bein HaPrakim, between chapters. And the Mishnah explains, Bein Bracha Rishona Lashnia, between the first bracha and the second bracha. So we know in Berachos Krishma we have the first bracha, which goes all the way up to Yotzer HaMoros. That's the first bracha. And then Bein Shnia Lishma, between Avarabba and Shema. So those areas in between. And then you have Bein Shema Levahaya Im Shemoah, between the first parsha of Kriya Shema, which is, between the first sentence of Kriya Shema, which is Shema, and the second paragraph, or I should say the first paragraph, which is V'hayim Shema, and then Bein V'hayim Shema L'Vayomer, between the second paragraph of V'hayim Shema and Vayomer, and then Bein Vayomer L'Emes V'yatzev, between Vayomer and Emes V'yatzev, which is the paragraph that follows Kriya Shema. Yehuda says Bein Vayomer L'Emes V'yatzev Lo Yafsik. Person should never stop between the paragraph of Vayomer and Emes V'yatzev, and we'll get to that later in Mitzvah Hashem. We don't ever want to make a break between Hashem Elokeichem and the word Emes. It looks like a person is separating Emes, truth, from Hashem Elokeichem, and therefore we always are careful to say Hashem Elokeichem and immediately follow it with the word Emes, so much so that people actually think the word Emes is part of Kriya Shema. It's not. We just say Hashem Elokeichem and immediately respond with Emes, not to make any break between Hashem Elokeichem and Emes. And that's his halacha. Bein Vayomer Emes V'yatzev Lo Yafsek. A person should never take a break, should never interrupt between Hashem Elokeichem and Emes. Rabbi Yeshua, the Mishnah continues. Rabbi Yeshua says, Sorry, Amr Bishua ben Karcha. Bishua ben Karcha says, Lama kadma parshas Shema levahaya im Shema. Why is it that the parsha of Shema, which is Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shemayim, Shema Yisrael, we say Hashem, Shema Yisrael, listen Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hashem is our Lord, Hashem is one. Why does that come before Vahayim Shema? The Gemara, the Mishnah answers, Kidei, She Yikabel Alav Ol Malchus Shemayim Techila. First, a person accepts upon himself the oak of Malchus Shemayim, and then V'achakach Mekabel of Ol Mitzvahs, then he accepts the yoke of mitzvahs. And this is just the logical progression. If a person is going to do mitzvahs, he has to know for whom or for what purpose he's doing those mitzvahs. So Shema comes first, to first set the stage to whom we pledge our allegiance, and that is to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then we talk about what those mitzvahs are. And then V'hayam Shema levayomer. Why does V'hayam Shema come before Vayomer? The Mishnah answers, Yeshua ben Karcha answers, Shev'hayam Shema noeg bein bayom bein balayla. All mitzvos are relevant during the day and during the evening. Vayomer, the parsha of Vayomer, specifically the area of Vayomer which refers to tzitzis, eina noeg ela bayom belvad. The mitzvah of tzitzis is one which is obligatory only during the day, but is not obligatory at night. So we do recite the parsha of Vayomer even in the evening. However, the mitzvah described within it to wear tzitzis is only relevant during the day. Now the Gemara goes on to a discussion. The Gemara says, Shema mina, it seems from here, mitzvos tzrichos kavana. Since the first line of the Mishnah told us that if a person is reading Kriya Shema, then it depends. If a person is just randomly up to that parsha of V'aschanan, he's reading Kriya Shema, the halacha is, according to the Mishnah, if he had in mind to fulfill his mitzvah of Kriya Shema, he fulfills the mitzvah. If not. That clearly seems to indicate, says the Gemara, that if a person wants to properly fulfill a mitzvah, then he has to have kavanah to fulfill the mitzvah. Just doing it is not enough. And the reason why the Gemara asks this question is because this is a discussion throughout Shas whether or not that's true. Therefore, if we have an explicit Mishnah which seems to indicate that a person does have to have kavanah when fulfilling a mitzvah, we should bring a raya from there. The Gemara says, no, our Mishnah is not a raya. Mai im kivein libo. What does our Mishnah mean when it says that if he had in mind in his heart, im kivein libo likros? It means likros. He had in mind to read it. The Gemara says, likros? Hold on a second. You're telling me he had in mind to read it? V'hakakari. Of course he has in mind to read it. He's reading it. What else is he doing? So what does it mean he has in mind to read it? In other words, the understanding initially was that we thought it meant, of course he's reading it. So the question is, when he's reading it, does he have kavanah? Does he have the intention to fulfill his mitzvah? The Gemara answers and says no. Of course, everybody agrees he doesn't actually have to have kavanah to fulfill the mitzvah. What does it mean when he has kavanah? It means he has kavanah to read it. The Gemara says, that can't be the answer. V'hakakari. Of course he's reading it. The Mishnah says, hayakore. The Gemara answers, bakore lehagia. It's talking about a person who is reading it not because he actually wants to read the contents, but he wants to edit it. He wants to make sure there are no mistakes. So yes, he's reading it, but he's not reading it for the sake of reading what it says. Rather, he's reading it for the sake of finding mistakes. Now, the problem is that doesn't really seem to answer the question, because he still is reading it. And that's what bothers Tosfos. Tosfos asked this question. Therefore, Tosfos explains that this means the person is reading it, but he's reading it improperly because he wants to make sure that everything is spelled correctly. For example, there are some words that have an extra vav in it, some words don't have an extra vav. For example, the word totafos sometimes has a vav, sometimes doesn't. So when he's reading it, he might read it totefes, just to indicate to himself how to properly spell it, but that's an improper pronunciation of the word. So that's what it means, korelagia. It means he's reading it, but he's reading it improperly. In such a case, if he has in mind to read it properly, then he will fulfill his mitzvah. If not, not. The Gemara continues. Tana Rabbanan. We were taught, Kriya Shema kiksava. A person has to read Kriya Shema in its original language. That means a person cannot read Kriya Shema in any language they want. It must be written, it must be read and it must be read and recited every single day, exactly in the language that was written in the Torah. Divrei Rabbi, those are the words of Rabbi. Chachamim omrim, the Chachamim disagree, and they say b'chal lashon. A person can say Kriya Shema in every language. Just parenthetically, people don't really know this, but this actually is the halach like the Chachamim. In Simin Samach Beis and Shulchan Aruch, Sif Beis, it says very clearly a person can't say Kriya Shema in any language. However, the Mishnah Brura quantifies this and says it's only true if the person understands that language. So if a person is reading it in English and they understand English, that would be okay. The same is true with regard to Tefillah and Berachos HaMazon. However, Mishnah Brura does point out that that is the Iker Halacha. That's the strict letter of the law. But the mitzvah min hamuvchar is to actually read Kriya Shema in Hebrew as it's written inside the Torah. But let's analyze this machlokas over here to try to understand what's going on. The Gemara says, "My time at the Rabbi." What is the reason for Rabbi? Why is it that Rabbi says that a person must read Kriya Shema specifically only in its original language of Lashon HaKodesh? He responds and he says, "Amar Kra." The pasuk says, "V'hayu." I mean, it says, "V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela." Generally speaking, when the Torah specifies v'hayu, it means b'havyasan yehu. It should remain exactly as it was when it was given. So since it says v'hayu, therefore Rebbe says it must be written, it must be recited in Lashon HaKodesh. Rabbanan my time. What's the reason for the Rabbanan who say it can be written, it can be not written, it can be recited, it can be said or read in any language? Amar Kra, the pasuk tells us, Shema. The words are Shema. It's called Kriya Shema. Shema indicates that you'll hear it, which means B'chol Lashon Sh'ata Shomea. Any language that you can easily hear into your ears. Rabbi, the Gemara says, hold on. Rabbi also has to contend with that. Rabbi Nami Haksiv Shema. It says Shema in the pasuk, so therefore that Shema should be inclusive of any language. So the Gemara answers, Hahu mi boile. He needs that word of mi boile. He needs that word of Shema, to teach us, He shama le'oznecha, masha'ata motzi mipicha. According to Rebbe, a person has an obligation to say Kriya Shema loud enough that they can actually hear it. Rabbanon savri lehu kamanta amar lo ishmiya la'ozno yatsa. Rabbanon do not need the word Shema to tell you that you actually have to hear yourself say Shema, because they are of the opinion that if a person does not hear themselves reciting Kriya Shema, then they are still yotzi, they still fulfill the mitzvah. And again, that is the halacha. If you look again at Siman Samach Beis, it says tzarich la'ashmiya la'ozno ma'shamotzi mipiv ve'im lo hishmiya la'ozno yatsa. So even though it's preferable for a person to hear himself recite Kriya Shema, nevertheless, if a person does not hear it, then they fulfill the mitzvah. But the Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch says, he actually has to actually mouth the words. So you can't just read it with your eyes. As long as you mouth the words, it's okay, even if you don't actually hear it. But again, the mitzvah min hamuvchar, as we explained earlier, is to recite it in Lashon HaKodesh and to actually hear yourself say Kriya Shema. The Gemara continues with Rabbanon nami haksiv v'hayu. Hold on a second. Rebbe told us it says v'hayu, which indicates you have to say Kriya Shema exactly as it was written. So he got there from the word v'hayu. So the Rabbanon have to deal with that also. They have to contend with the fact that it says v'hayu. The Gemara answers that whom ba'ilahu, the Chachamim use that word v'hayu, shalo yikra l'mafreya. That it has to be, the b'havyasan yehei means you have to recite Kriya Shema in order, you can't go backwards. Exactly what it means to go backwards, Rashi explains, actually fascinatingly, that it means you can't read the words, not the words, but the actual Kriya Shema backwards. In other words, according to Rashi, the Gemara is telling you, you would have thought you can say, Ubisharecha, Beisecha, mezuzos, instead of saying mezuzos beisecha b'sharecha. Now the Gemara is teaching us that you can't do that. Chacham are saying no, you can't do that. It's fascinating that someone would actually think that something like that should work, because when you'll say it, it actually will have no definition. It will mean nothing. Simply, I think the simple way of understanding it would be that you'll say the entire psukim backwards. You'll say pasuk 2 before pasuk 1, but that's not how Rashi understands it. So the Gemara goes on, and the Gemara says, "V'Rebbe shelo yikr mafreya minale." According to Rebbe, they already used the word v'hayu to tell you that it has to be said in Hebrew. How does he know you can't read Kriya Shema out of order? The Gemara says, "Nafkale me devarim hadvarim." It says v'hayu hadvarim. The additional letter of hey indicates it has to be said exactly in the order that it was written. For Rabbanon, according to the Rabbanon, devarim Hadvarim lo darshi. They don't darshan the extra hay. The Gemara says, Lememra, Do you mean to tell me the Savar Rebbe, the Kol Torah Kula B'chol Lashon Nemar? Are you telling me that according to Rebbe, the rest of the Torah can be said in any other language? Now we'll see soon what this means, the rest of the Torah, but let's just continue. For if it will enter your mind, B'Lashon HaKodesh Nemar, that has to be said specifically in Lashon HaKodesh. Why do you have to have a special indication when it comes to Kriya Shema to tell you that it has to be said in Hebrew if it's true all over the place? Gemara says that wouldn't be enough. I still would have to have the word V'hayu Mishum L'chsiv Shema, because at the end of the day it says Shema, and just like the Chachamim understand from there Halacha L'maisa that you can say Kriya Shema in another language, according to Rebbe, the word Shema would have indicated that you can say Shema in any other language. Comes along the word V'hayu to say no, it specifically must be recited in Lashon HaKodesh. The Gemara says, okay, L'memra de Savri Rabbanan Kol Torah Kula B'Lashon HaKodesh Nemra. You're telling me that according to the Chachamim, that the rest of the Torah needs to be said specifically in Hebrew. In other words, if they have if you're going to tell me that you could say the rest of the Torah in any other language, Shema D'Kas Rachman Alamali. In other words, if you have to have the word Shema to teach you that you can recite Kriya Shema in another language, that indicates that you would have thought that that's not the case anywhere else. The Gemara says, Itztrich, we still need to have the word Shema, Mishum D'Siv V'hayu. Again, the words Shema and V'hayu were important words in Kriya Shema. One may have thought that Shema teaches you can say it in English, comes along, or any other language, comes along V'hayu according to Rebbe, and says, no, you can't say it, you can't recite Kriya Shema in another language, it has to be specifically in Lashon HaKodesh. And the same thing works the opposite, according to the Chachamim. The word V'hayu would have led you to believe that Kriya Shema must be recited in Lashon HaKodesh, and a person does not fulfill the mitzvah if they recite it in another language, comes along the word Shema to tell you that it can be recited in any language that you understand. Now, what does it mean when it talks about the rest of Torah being recited or learned in another language? Obviously, if we're talking about Kriyas, just learning Torah, Limud Torah, a person must learn Torah in the language that they understand. It would be ridiculous to say that a person can't learn Torah in the language they understand, because Torah is an obligation for everyone to understand and to live by. So what does it mean when the Gemara is talking about whether or not Torah can be recited in another language in other areas? So Tosfos deals with this. And Tosfos says, this refers to, this is Tosfos B'Lashon HaKodesh, she says, V'yeshlomar, D'mayri beparshios ha-mechuyavin likros d'oraisa k'mo parsha zachar. This refers to Kriyas HaTorah. When we lane in shul, obviously you can't be talking about the typical Kriyas HaTorah that we have in shul on Shabbos or during the week, because those, while they are chiyuvim that were initiated later. Ezra was the one who instituted that, but this was not instituted by the Torah itself. So therefore, it's a din midrabanan, it's not a din midoraisa. So if we're talking about that can't be the issue. Rather, Tosfos says, this is talking about the Kriyas HaTorah, which is midoraisa, which is biblical, which is the Kriya of Parshas Zachar. So Parshas Zachar is what we are referring to, whether or not it has to be recited in Hebrew. And ultimately, that is what the Gemara is discussing. We have Rabbi, who's of the opinion that Kriya Shema needs to be recited in Lashon HaKodesh, but the rest of the Torah, which according to Tosfos means Parsha Zachar, can be recited in other languages. According to the Chachamim, then even Kriya Shema can be recited in other languages. Tosfos has another understanding that there are times when there's an obligation to read parts of the Torah, like when a person brings Bikurim, or Vidoy Meiser, or Chalitza. There are different times when different parts of the Torah have to be read. In those cases, the halacha is that that's what the Gemara is talking about. We will stop here for today. In Amir Hashem next week, we will pick up on the bottom of Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, and we will, Amir Hashem, continue with Yud Gimel Amud Beis. Have a wonderful evening.